Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching First Muslim Civil War, Early Muslim Expansion by Kings and Generals. So, last time we witnessed the Caliphate's continued expansion across North Africa, and up until this point, we've really seen the establishment of the Caliphate as an empire. They've taken a lot of territory from both the Sassanid and the Roman empires. In fact, the Sassanid Empire is crumbling into dust as we watch this series. Maybe it has a little bit to go, but it has fallen from grace very mightily. I'm excited to get into this video and see where we will go next. I mean, this one's titled Muslim Civil War, so that sounds pretty spicy. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
In less than a generation, the young Muslim faith had gone from a niche religious movement in the Arabian desert to the greatest empire in Eurasia, accomplishing the unthinkable in crippling the ancient lineage of the Persians. And
this is true. I mean, I think I mentioned this before in this series, but it took Christianity a lot longer to sort of grow and spread and become the religion of the dominant empire of the region, the Roman Empire. Of course, Judaism would never have an empire of that status. We have the emergence of Islam, and then almost immediately we have the formation of the Caliphate, the first Muslim empire. So it was really a very quick process. We went from, the founding of the religion to empire building straight away. It's pretty remarkable.
And seizing the extremely wealthy lands of Egypt and Syria. Yet, as seen time and again, the larger empires grow, the more prone they grow to fracture. Thus, Season 3 of our series on early Muslim expansion will begin with the fitness, the civil wars which saw internal turmoil engulf the massive caliphal realm.
Yeah, this is interesting. Once again, I mentioned this a little bit before, but I think we're going to get a lot more of it in this video, which is, as the Caliphate expands, as it becomes a major empire, it's starting to face some of the problems that, say, the Roman Empire is often confronted with. The inability to defend its territory, being stretched too thin, political issues throughout the empire. The Caliphate, it's not really facing those in a major way, but it looks like it's going to begin having some of those problems that come with being a major empire. It's inevitable, it's just what happens.
In those times, you needed a whole house of wisdom to store and process knowledge. Now we've got an easier way with the sponsor of our video, Blinkist. They condense non-fiction.
So shout out to Kings and Generals. Please go and check out their video, which is linked in my description below. Go and give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and check out their sponsor. Basically show them some support for making this fantastic content.
And also 25% off a premium membership. Initially, the reign of Caliph Uthman ibn Affan was a time of progress for the growing Rashidun Caliphate.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of last time, we basically, well, maybe not at the end, but we saw the death of Umar and the ascension of Uthman. So, on to the next caliph. Let's see what he's all about. We've seen a little bit of Uthman, but, we're going to see more of him in this video, presumably.
The governor of Egypt, Abdullah ibn Sa'ad, had used the new standing navy of the Caliphate to secure a steady tribute from the island of Cyprus in 649, before defeating the Eastern Romans at sea in the Battle of the Masts.
I mean, we basically ended last time with the Caliphate turning more towards the Mediterranean Sea and starting to get into some naval combat with the Roman Empire. They decided that as long as the Romans were the dominant naval power of the Mediterranean, the Caliphate wouldn't truly be able to control a lot of the land they had just seized from the Romans. Because if the Romans controlled the sea, they could always sail back in and try and retake a lot of these cities that they'd lost. And so one of the goals that the Caliphate was aiming towards was, becoming master of the seas, taking that position from the Roman Empire.
Meanwhile, the advancing armies of Anaf ibn Qais and Abdullah ibn Amr were making further headway into the rapidly crumbling Sassanid Empire.
Yeah, they used the exact same phrase I did in the intro, crumbling. That's what the Sassanid Empire is at this point. It is disintegrating. It really doesn't have much longer to go.
Yazdegerd III, last of the Persian King of Kings, had been reduced to little more than a fugitive, fleeing from city to city ahead of the conquerors. After the fall of Fars province between 649 and 650, attempts to raise support in first Kerman and then Sekistan each failed, with the governors of these provinces refusing to pay taxes to a destitute and powerless emperor or harbor him from the advancing Arabs.
I mean, yeah, if you're a governor or a lord or someone in a high position in the Sassanid Empire, at this point, you can obviously see the writing on the wall. You know the caliphate is going to continue expanding, and so there's really no reason to shelter the emperor or to aid the emperor unless it's just pure loyalty to the Sassanid state. Unless you have that sort of loyalty for some reason, you're not going to get anything out of helping him. Like, you know that the empire is pretty much done, and you need to prepare yourself for what's coming, which is Muslim rule. So it's really not in your interest to help Yazdegerd at that point.
Finally withdrawing to Merv, he made a last-ditch effort to stem the tide by appealing to his allies among the Hephthalite principalities. Some soldiers were indeed sent to support him, but they would never see battle against the Arabs. Unwilling to continue throwing away lives in a hopeless war after the desertion or surrender of Yazdegerd's vassals, his last general, Farrukhzad, abandoned him in 651, with Merv's governor, Mahuisuri, turning against him as well shortly after.
Yeah, I mean, look, loyalty's important, and I can respect someone being loyal until the end, but in a case like this, I cannot really blame these guys for saying, you know what, I'm leaving. There's nothing left for me here, because there's not. There really isn't. Would you want to stay beside an emperor who no longer has his empire? His empire is crumbling before him? You know, probably not.
With his last supporters defeated by Suri's own Hephthalite allies, the King of Kings finally met his end, hiding in the home of a humble miller outside Merv, murdered for his jewelry.
Wow.
While local resistance...
Yeah, pretty ignoble way to go. Khalid. We also saw him have a rather ignoble death. It's perhaps, even more so with Yazdegerd, given that he was the emperor of one of the most important empires of that time period. And now he has been, murdered in a, like I said, pretty ignoble manner. There's nothing grand about that murder, and his empire is basically gone. That's quite a way to go.
Would continue into Baristan for years to follow. The once great Sassanid Empire had ceased to exist, its dynasty continuing only through a family of exiles taking refuge in China.
Interesting.
But for all...
Interesting. All the way in China. I would have thought they might have been sheltered closer to home, but maybe that was still risky, because obviously Islam will spread, quite a bit further east. And China was always a powerful empire, so maybe it was one of the few places willing to shelter them. That is a very fascinating tidbit.
All the military victories of the Caliphate during Uthman's 12-year reign, its domestic policies would soon beget internal turmoil for the young and rapidly expanding state. The aging caliph's nepotism and unpopular economic policies created growing opposition to his rule from various strands of society. During Umar's reign, laws had been set in place forbidding Arab soldiers from buying land in conquered territories.
Yeah, Umar was quite the micromanager, and he sometimes had issues with his generals over that, but like I said last time, Umar was seemingly quite competent. He did his job very well. He managed the expansion of the empire, and he also governed it well. So, like I said, there were some complaints, but overall he seems to have done a pretty impressive job.
Keeping soldiers strictly separated from local populations, both to prevent foreign influences on the faith of his victorious armies, and to protect the property of the conquered. Under Uthman, these restrictions were removed, causing many soldiers in the Caliphate's armies to buy up huge tracts of land in Syria and Iraq.
See, that's not great. And up until this point, we've seen a lot of the local populations either being relatively okay with their new overlords, going from the Roman Empire to the Caliphate, or we've seen a lot of conversions. And I presume part of that was, you can see here, Umar was, at least making an effort to protect those who had recently been conquered, trying to allow them to keep their property, allowing them to sort of live how they had been living to a certain extent. If you're a local, and to be fair, you probably didn't have much love for the Roman Empire, and now you're under the rule of the Caliphate. If the rule of the Caliphate isn't too bad, then, you might not mind. But if your land is being taken from you and there's a system of exploitation, you'll probably be pretty upset about it.
In some cases abusing their power and authority in order to drive inhabitants out and resell the same land at large profits, creating a new class of wealthy ex-soldiers establishing lavish estates across the Caliphate.
Yeah, that's a good way to please your soldiers, the people who fought for you in order to expand the empire. They're going to be very happy that they're getting this wealth and property, but it's a bad way to govern an empire because the inhabitants of your empire are going to be very displeased with your rule.
This new taste for luxury among the conquerors drove up taxes and created great resentment among both non-Muslims and non-Arab converts.
Yeah, I'm sure.
On top of economic friction, Uthman also created for himself a theological controversy through his creation of a unified official version of the Quran. Prior to this, the ad hoc nature by which the Prophet's revelations were recorded and transmitted by his closest companions meant that many Qurans had minor variations in the text from one to the next.
This is some pretty typical religion stuff. We see the same thing with Christianity, for example. Official texts being different from texts that certain groups of people followed. And then, there's disputes over, this shouldn't be in the official text, or that's not what happened, or that's not what Christ or Muhammad said. We see, like I said, we see this conflict in a lot of religions, and this can cause, splits, and, different groups amongst the religion believing different things. And this will usually start to happen in particular when you have an empire associated with your religion. For example, the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, and then they tried to standardize a lot of aspects within Christianity. And that was a massive problem because there were a lot of Christians across a wide area of land, and they believed different things. They had, a similar general set of beliefs, but there were differences. And I imagine Uthman is going to run into some of those same issues here.
Undermining a faith based on an eternal and infallible word of God. To correct this, Uthman had a gathering of religious scholars determine the canon account of the Prophet's words, gathering and burning as many of the variant Qurans as possible.
Yeah, and to be fair, it probably is a little easier here because by the time the Roman Empire was adopting and trying to standardize Christianity, it had been a while since the time of Christ. But, Uthman is trying to standardize Islam. It has not been that long since Muhammad was around. So they probably have a better chance of accurately getting down what his words were.
The Quran of Uthman remains unchanged as the holy text for Muslims around the world today. But during his reign, some Muslims disagreed with the decisions Uthman's scholars reached, or saw the destruction of any Quran as sacrilegious, adding their voices to the growing opposition to his rule.
Fair.
The long-simmering resentment against Caliph Uthman boiled into open rebellion in 656. In Egypt, Kufr and Basra, disaffected soldiers from local garrison towns gathered and marched on Medina to demand Uthman's deposition and the election of a new caliph.
Yeah, well, Egypt is never pleased when it's under the rule of some other empire. We saw that, when they were a part of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of religious tension between Egypt and Constantinople. And once again, Egypt is now under the domination of a different empire, they're not happy. They're never happy in that position. Makes sense. I mean, Egypt has a great history of its own, and it was once a great empire of its own right, and so it kind of chafes under occupation by other peoples or other empires.
Having been told by agents that the grievances against him were frivolous and a revolt unlikely, Uthman was caught unprepared when the bands of soldiers converged on Medina. Though he refused to step down as caliph, Uthman attempted to reach a peaceful settlement, sending Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's son-in-law and one of the first Muslims, to negotiate with the rebels on his behalf.
Yeah, Uthman's using his clout. He's saying, you want to depose me? Well, look who I've got on my side. How about that? That's definitely, that's dropping a name. You're saying, well, how about I send Ali? That's a pretty impressive name to drop in that situation.
The smaller Kufen and Basran detachments were convinced to make peace with Uthman, while the larger Egyptian force was mollified with a promise to remove their unpopular governor, Abdullah, from governorship in favor of Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, the son of the first caliph. With Ali as guarantee of the agreement, and Ibn Abi Bakr leading them, they began their return to Egypt, apparently ending the immediate danger for Uthman. But on their return journey, the soldiers waylaid a messenger bound for Egypt with orders to have the rebel leaders executed. Taking it as a sign of treachery on Uthman's part, the rebels returned to Medina and surrounded Uthman's home, besieging him within, and once again demanded his resignation. Whether Uthman really ordered the rebels executed is unclear, with most accounts crediting the message not to Uthman but to his cousin and secretary, the future caliph Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Whatever the truth of the matter, the rebels cut off water to Uthman's house and gave increasingly threatening demands for his abdication.
Hey, this is getting pretty dangerous from Uthman. I'm surprised he didn't have more defenses set up around him to protect him from this sort of thing. But, I mean, these are pretty classic emperor problems. A mob charges your house or some rebel soldiers. They've got an issue. You're going to have to deal with that, and oftentimes by force.
Until one of Marwan's servants slew one of the rebel spokesmen with a stone from the balcony on June 16th, making a bloody end to the affair, all but inevitable.
Yeah.
Abandoned by most of his Umayyad clan, with the Iraqi rebels and notables of Medina remaining neutral, Uthman ordered his remaining defenders to stand down in hopes of avoiding bloodshed between Muslims when the rebels...
Uthman's kind of been deserted, huh? He doesn't... he's not getting a lot of people coming to his aid.
...attacked the house the following day. Regardless, Marwan and the children of Ali refused this order and attempted to save the life of their caliph. As Uthman sat for his noon prayers, Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr and a few of the Egyptian rebels climbed into his home from the roof of a neighboring house, threatening the caliph at sword point.
Wow.
Though accounts differ on the specific events, and on Abi Bakr's role in particular, the final outcome was the same. Uthman was the first caliph to be murdered by his fellow Muslims, an event that would shake the Muslim world to its core.
I did not expect him to go out so easily. I thought he'd put up a bit more resistance, but there you go. Uthman is now gone, assassinated by fellow Muslims. That's pretty remarkable.
Following the murder, the rebel bands effectively controlled Medina, and under their influence, particularly the Iraqis, Ali was elevated to the role of caliph. As the Prophet's son-in-law and one of the major candidates in the previous election, Ali seemed a safe and popular choice.
Yeah.
However, his reign would be saddled with the scandal of Uthman's murder, and demands for justice placed the new caliph in a difficult position.
Well, this is what happens when you don't have sort of a clear line of succession. You can have issues like this, rebellions, the leader was killed, you appoint a new one, regardless of how good the second guy is, and we've seen this repeatedly throughout history. If they got into power through some gruesome event, like the murder of the previous emperor, oftentimes their reign can be stained by that beginning. They'll never get past it. They don't have the legitimacy or the belief of the people anymore because of how their reign started. This is why in the modern world where we have elections, getting elected to a position of power, that is a far more legitimate way to bring yourself up to that level, to bring yourself to a leadership role than, say, murdering the last guy or being basically selected by a group of rebels who murdered the last guy. That's sort of a tricky situation.
Given Ali's efforts to defuse the rebellion and the injuries his own son Hassan suffered in Uthman's defense, it is incredibly unlikely he had any role in his predecessor's murder.
Yeah, but like I said, even if he's not involved, people can see that event is directly what led to him being appointed, so his rule can still be stained by that event.
Many of the rebels who had opposed Uthman were now his most important supporters,
right.
So punishing them would have alienated his power base and potentially led to his own demise. Stuck in a trap, Ali allowed Uthman's murder to go unpunished, which led to accusations of weakness and complicity.
Yeah, it's not a good precedent to have. Even if you benefited from the murder of the last empire, I would say it's probably better to punish the guys who murdered the last guy, just to set a precedent, like, hey, murdering the emperor isn't a good thing, and also I don't condone this. Of course, it can be tricky, because in this case, those guys who murdered the last caliph, they're your supporters. And so you don't want to alienate your own supporters, but I would say you should have doled out some punishment, at least to send a message, like, look, I don't condone what happened, and I don't want it happening again.
Particularly from Uthman's powerful Umayyad clan, laying the groundwork for the First Islamic Civil War.
Wow.
The first stirrings of conflict came from Talha ibn Ubaydullah and Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Ali's main competitors in the election that had brought him to the throne. In the past, the two had fought alongside Ali as comrades. But despite Talha's own previous opposition to Uthman, they had been among the most vocal for action against the rebels, and were quick to make common cause with another of Ali's detractors, Aisha, the widow of the Prophet himself.
Oh yeah, that's another famous name. See, this is what I've said before, we are not that far from Muhammad himself, and so you see some very important names who were around alongside Muhammad still popping up in this early Muslim history. It's just really crazy to see these really important figures to Islam, emerging later on in Muslim history. And I'm really curious to see where this goes. I mean, I didn't even know there was a Muslim civil war. Of course, I don't know much about Muslim history, so I'm really interested to see what's going to happen.
With Aisha as the unifying spiritual figurehead of the rebellion, funding from numerous Umayyad governors deposed by Ali at the beginning of his reign, and several prominent Muslim leaders, including Marwan and the murdered caliph's son, Aban ibn Uthman, flocking to her banner, Aisha's rebel army represented a significant challenge to Ali's leadership.
Yeah, I mean, looks like she has a lot of support, a lot of power, and there's also legitimacy. I mean, there's legitimacy on both sides. Both Ali and Aisha have a connection to the Prophet Muhammad. So they do both have a level of religious legitimacy to draw from.
Unfortunately for the so-called Mother of the Faithful, a number of crucial mistakes would undermine her cause. A great deal of effort was wasted trying to rally support in Iraq, despite most of the region being loyal to Ali.
Yeah.
Then, when rebel leadership left Mecca to gain support in Basra in mid-October 656, internal discord fomented within their cause. Talha and Zubair were jockeying against each other for authority, while the secrecy of the army's destination created resentment from Marwan and the Umayyad clansmen within the army, who saw the insurgency more as a blood feud than a rebellion, and would have preferred to simply march to Medina and execute the conspirators who had slain Uthman, rather than waging a campaign to topple Ali.
Well, I mean, this is what happens when your rebellions are so personal. But it does seem like it might have just been a better idea to march on Medina and just immediately take over. Instead of marching across the desert to Iraq, where many of the rebels had come from in the first place, trying to gather a wider base of support. I mean, it's important to, gather more support from the entire caliphate. But, I'm not sure if this was the best course of action necessarily.
The anti-Ali movement was dealt another blow in December, when Aisha and her followers arrived in Basra. After hearing the speeches and calls to arms of Zubair and Talha in the marketplace outside the city, the reaction of the Basran populace was divided, with some offering support, while others denounced her. The first fighting of her rebellion occurred immediately after, when numerous market-goers loyal to Aisha or Ali began to scrap in the marketplace and strike each other with the soles of their shoes. More important than any
classic marketplace brawl was the first engagement of this civil war. Quite a way to start.
Marketplace brawl, however, was the response of Basra's governor, Uthman ibn Hanif, who remained loyal to Ali. However, reluctant to bring bloodshed to his city, he allowed the rebels to camp the night while he waited for word from Ali, who...
I'm interested to see how everybody deals with this because, of course, this is a pretty militarized empire, but so far, it's been expanding outwards. It's been defeating the Romans and the Persians and a bunch of, other tribes and polities throughout the region. And now those weapons are going to be turned on their fellow Muslims. This is the first time we're really seeing something like this. I mean, that's why it's so fascinating. So I do wonder how everybody's going to handle this. I mean, Aisha's side seems ready to fight, frankly. So I'm curious to see, what the governor of Basra is going to decide to do.
Who was now on his way from Medina. A message from the Caliph soon arrived, instructing Ibn Hanif to give the rebels an ultimatum of loyalty to Ali or warfare.
Alright, well, there you go. Looks like Ali's ready to fight as well. He's saying, look, you need to declare your loyalty to me, and we can end this now, or we're going to fight it out. So, both sides are now ready to go, officially.
But by then, Aisha's army had already managed to entrench themselves in a defensible camp near the local garrison's storehouse. It should be noted that even after Caliph Uthman's murder, the thought of outright warfare between Muslims remained almost unthinkable to most.
Yeah.
And so the prominent poet and scholar Salim ibn Amr al-Duwali was sent to make a lasting treaty for peace and to end the rebellion. When it was refused, Basra's cavalry commander, Hukaym ibn Jabala, stormed out with the governor's local forces. A short and bloody battle around Aisha's camp ensued. Many on both sides died, but the rebels were not dislodged. Afterwards, an uneasy ceasefire was signed, intended to last until Ali's arrival.
It's an interesting... Civil wars are always a sort of interesting situation. I mean, in this case we're talking about... it's not necessarily the same people. I mean, it's a lot of Arabs, but of course we also have Persians, Iraqis, different ethnic groups. But in this case, it's all people under the same religion, which should supposedly bind you together, but nevertheless, they have stuff to fight about. I think every civil war is interesting in this way, sort of the ideological aspect, how people feel about fighting their fellow countrymen or their fellow Muslims in this case. And that's true for any civil war, whether, one of the countless Roman civil wars, the American Civil War, the English Civil War, whatever it is. It's always fascinating to see people who are bonded through some identity have to, pick up arms and go to war with their brothers, their countrymen, whatever it is.
The ceasefire would be short-lived, however. If Aisha remained unwilling to submit, Ali's arrival would only leave the rebels hopelessly outnumbered. So, on Talha's advice, a party of rebels captured the Basran governor in a surprise raid as he led the evening's prayers in the mosque, giving him 40 lashes and plucking his beard and eyelashes before imprisoning him.
Jeez. So both, obviously a pretty brutal punishment with the lashes, but also just humiliating. Damn, that's rough.
The following morning, Zubayr's son Abdallah led the rebels in an attack on the storehouse, killing 40 converted ex-slaves from Sind who had been posted as guards, and seizing the grain meant for the townfolk's winter provisions.
Ooh.
Hukaim arrived shortly after in a great rage, demanding
Yeah, the rebels are playing dirty. I mean, they have no qualms. They're getting right in there.
Abdallah release the governor and berating him for the killing of Muslims innocent of any role in Uthman's murder. When Abdallah refused, Hukaim attacked with the 700 men still with him, finding himself quickly surrounded and overwhelmed by the
Yeah, I understand his frustration. I mean, the rebels are playing dirty, like I said, but that was definitely a decision made out of anger. That was not a decision that was well thought through, because he is well outnumbered, and, you know, definitely a mistake, but I do understand his frustration.
larger rebel army. Though he fought fiercely until the end, fatally striking one of the rebels with his own severed leg, according to one rather fanciful account.
Wow.
Hukaim
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've talked about the unreliability of ancient sources in the past, and that sounds completely crazy. Probably didn't happen, but what a story. If it did happen, that is, well, I guess that shows you the drive. He was willing to fight until the very end, whacking people with his severed body parts. Wow.
his son, and many of his soldiers were killed, with the rest fleeing or surrendering, and leaving the rebels in full control of Basra. With Ali en route, the victorious rebels had little time to gather support for their movement. Though control of the city and its treasury brought most of the surrounding tribes at least nominally under Aisha's banner, emissaries sent north to Kufa had less success. While the province's governor, Abu Musa ibn Ashari, attempted to remain neutral, Kufan notable Zaid ibn Suhan, after receiving a message from Aisha fondly addressing him as a beloved son, as befitting her title of Mother of the Faith, responded that her beloved son would prefer her to stay safely at home.
Yeah, I think she's gonna have a really hard time gathering support. I mean, we're already seeing that she's having a hard time gathering support, but particularly in this conflict. I mean, it's always hard for the rebel faction during a civil war to gather support, but this case in particular, like we said, you know, a lot of people just aren't up for the violence that a civil war entails, and so they'd rather just stay neutral, stick with the status quo, and not get involved. They don't want bloodshed with fellow Muslims, so that's going to make it really difficult for Aisha to, you know, gather supporters who are willing to fight on her side.
Ali's efforts were more fruitful. Sending his son Al-Hassan to Kufa, Abu Musa was soon deposed, and more than 6,000 men were gathered for the retaking of Basra.
I imagine it'd be a lot easier for Ali to gather support because, you know, although we mentioned how him ascending to the position of caliph was sort of colored by the murder of Uthman, and so, you know, maybe lacking a little bit of legitimacy, he is still technically the rightful caliph. He does have that legitimacy. You know, he is the status quo, and so it's probably easier to go with that if you want to remain sort of neutral or you're not really interested in a protracted conflict.
With these joining Ali's 700 from Medina, and close to 2,000 who had gathered from various tribes along the caravan route, Ali arrived at Basra on December 5th with just under 10,000 men, met by Aisha's comparable army of Basrans and Meccans.
It is a pretty even matchup, though, or at least they have a rather comparable number of men. This could be a close one. I'm interested to see how this battle goes.
After 3 days of standoff and attempts to sway the Basran tribes, a horseman was sent between the armies by Ali with a Quran at the end of his lance to exhort both sides to an honorable combat. When he fell dead, pierced by arrows, battle was joined, and the two cavalry-heavy armies came crashing together like thunder. Despite Aisha having, by most accounts, at least as large an army as Ali prior to his arrival, defections of several Basran tribes, both before and during the battle, weakened her force significantly.
Yeah, that's not incredibly surprising, to be honest. We just talked about the reasons why, you know, going with Ali might be a little more attractive than sticking with the rebels.
In the center of Ali's army, Abu Qatada al-Numan led the Kufan foot soldiers, while Ali's son, Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, carried his father's standard. On the right wing of Ali's army, Malik al-Ashtar led the bulk of the Kufan cavalry, soon routing the tribesmen of the Banu Hanzala leading Aisha's left. And on Ali's left, the storied companion Ammar ibn Yasir is said by some to have driven Zubayr, who had been given overall command of the rebel army, to abandon his army and leave without fighting.
Wow. Yeah, this seems to be a pretty, good old-fashioned head-to-head fight. We haven't seen anything special or tricky yet. The two sides have lined up and they're just going for it.
Zubayr's desertion is a matter of some mystery. Despite his past victories and talent as a commander, all accounts agree he abandoned his army and retreated very early in the battle, though there are a variety of reasons given. Some suggest that secret correspondence from Ali convinced him he had taken the wrong path, or that the Prophet had once said that Ammar would die at the hands of a band of wicked men, leading Zubayr to question his role when the two came face to face on the battlefield. Others point to Aisha's refusal to acclaim him as Caliph on the eve of the battle, suggesting that she favoured Talha and that Zubayr's role in the rebellion had been a self-serving grab for the throne.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like one of those things in history that we're never going to know. I mean, we don't have the sources to back up either side convincingly, and so we can only speculate. Honestly, it could very well have been either, or it could have been something else. It could have been some secret correspondence with Ali, could have been frustration with Aisha, could have been that he simply felt guilty and decided not to participate. He could have, perhaps he felt like the battle wasn't going to go his way, and then he decided not to participate. Could have been one of many things, and, we'll probably never know.
Either way, his desertion left Talha to take command of a rapidly worsening situation. Leading a strong force of Basran cavalry, he made a number of charges against Ali's left and centre, at first with great success. But once Ali's right wing punched through his lines, he found his mobile cavalry bogged down and risking envelopment. Turning about to withdraw and regroup for another charge, he was mortally wounded by an arrow to the back of his knee, not at the hands of Ali's forces.
An arrow to the knee. Unfortunate, you can't recover from that one.
But of his supposed ally, Marwan, apparently as a spiteful act of vengeance for Talha's opposition to Uthman, now that their alliance to punish Ali and Uthman's murderers had come to naught. After firing the treacherous...
Yeah, so, it seems like Aisha's side didn't really have the cohesion that Ali did. These rebels were not really unified. I mean, rebels often aren't unified. They may be frustrated with the status quo, but for different reasons. Seems like a lot of these important men who joined up with Aisha sort of had their own personal reasons that didn't necessarily align with the other leaders and generals. So they were definitely lacking that unity.
Shot, Marwan was taken prisoner by Ali's victorious forces, while Aisha's leaderless forces collapsed. Named the Battle of the Camel after the camel Aisha had observed her defeat from the back of, this climactic battle in Basra had ended the first major challenge to Ali's caliphate, though further conflict remained ahead. Various figures are given for the casualties, with generally accepted figures hovering around 400 for Ali's army and 2,500 for Aisha's, the latter number being particularly high given that Ali pardoned all but one of the prisoners taken after the battle, but still plausible given the accounts of many rebels fighting on long after the army had fallen into disarray and defeat.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty large and tragic loss of life, but not necessarily horrific destruction. I mean, it's not going to be crippling for the Empire, say. That's more what I'm getting at. Oftentimes, civil war can, cripple the country that, is being affected by it. But in this case, while, like I said, it's still a tragic loss of life, Muslims fighting fellow Muslims, I imagine the Empire will still be okay after this.
Out of zealous devotion to Aisha. Of the three rebel leaders, only Aisha survived the battle and its aftermath, being escorted back to Medina by her brother Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, where she would live her days out in comfort, but with her political activity greatly curtailed.
Yeah, I mean, she's still an extremely important figure, and we see this throughout history, say in civil wars or revolts. when you have someone involved on the side of the rebels who is a very important figure for, in this case, a religious reason, but perhaps for a dynastic reason. They're a member of a legitimate royal family, or they're legitimate in some sense. It's probably a bad idea to execute them. That would cause perhaps another rebellion or a lot of issues. And so they're definitely better off taking her back, keeping an eye on her, but allowing her to live in comfort for the rest of her days. Given her importance in the caliphate, and in this case her importance to Islam. But like I said, there are other examples of this. You might have an important figure from another dynasty who the people still like and is still in some sense considered legitimate. You don't want to make a martyr out of them. You'll just bring them back to the capital city, keep an eye on them, let them live comfortably, but they're not allowed to leave.
Zubair was found shortly after the battle's end by a trio of tribesmen and murdered while apparently trying to escape to his ally Muawiyah, the governor of Syria.
Yikes.
The new caliph had triumphed in the first test of his rule, but Ali's throne would not remain secure for long. In this series' next episode, rebellion will engulf the caliphate once more, as internal turmoil becomes a grim new norm in the Islamic world.
Interesting.
Season 3 of the early Muslim conquests will continue soon.
Alright. Looks like we really are entering a period of turbulence. I mean, not like the empire's been super stable before this. I mean, the caliphate has been constantly expanding, but under Umar, and even under Uthman, but especially under Umar, there was definitely a sense of stability. He was really good at governing the caliphate, trying to sort of keep everybody happy, and even though Uthman's rule led to several rebellions, which would lead to his death, it was still relatively stable under him, but of course he laid the groundwork for what was to come. And now it seems like, since the rebellion under him, we're now entering a new period of turbulence. Not really long after the caliphate's birth. I mean, the caliphate hasn't been around for that long, and now it's already losing any stability that it had. So I'm really curious to see where exactly we're going. I mean, we've witnessed a lot of the external conquests of the caliphate. They've been expanding outwards, and now we're seeing some of the internal conflict, which is really fascinating. So I had a good time with this one. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.